going to be recorded and it will be available later on YouTube for anyone who wants to watch it on YouTube. Okay, sorry that didn't get on the first bit of the recording. Okay, so Phil, off you go. How long do you need? About 40 minutes or something like that?
Yeah, 40 minutes is fine.
So that gives us some questions at the time for questions at the end.
Any questions? Thank you very much, everybody, for coming along. As Bob said in the introduction, it's a presentation that is based on a book that's John Connell and Jusong Ding, the co-authors of the book. So I'll begin by following Bob, acknowledging the traditional owners of Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. And currently we're on unceded Gadigal country, and pay my respects to elders past, present, to those who may be emerging, and also to recognise, acknowledge any Torres Strait Islander and Aboriginal people in the room today, and anybody viewing this presentation, the recording online, the unceded lands on which you are currently on. So the book being passed around, but for the online, this is based upon a book that's come out about a month ago, roughly. It's called Chinese Tourism in Australia, Koalas, Selfies and Red Dresses. And John is the first author, myself and Jusong. So this presentation has been put together from various presentations. One at East China Normal University in Shanghai, another one at the International Geographical Congress in Dublin, and some new material added for today. Some of you who've been around here for a few years may have heard a presentation a while ago where to introduce what we were going to do and how the project was starting. Now we're looking at some of the work that has been done over time, including another academic publications. So Australian Geographer article, flower viewing from horseback, in other words, at a distance, new directions in Chinese tourism in Australia, and other journal articles in tourist studies and current issues in tourism. So in terms of the book, the contents of the book you can see there, it's goes a bit of history, just quickly a bit of history about the growth of Chinese tourism. I'll talk a little bit about that. Selling Australia, what's been done in media and marketing, and something I'll be referring to today, following the heart, and looking a little bit about what happens at the University of Sydney, where campus tourism meets Harry Potter, but focusing on Daka, the new Chinese tourist geography, and the use of colour, performance, photography in new geography. And it's a difference than what we normally associate with tourism. In some ways, it's partly product of the time with the age of smartphones and so on. Why was this necessary? Why did we think it was necessary to do that? Well, one of the reasons we started was we're looking around. There were a lot of tourists up at the University of Sydney, and we're starting to think, well, what are they doing there? Who are they? Where are they coming from? What are they expecting to find? Do they actually find it? Are they happy when they find it, or does it meet their expectations? And we decided to do a bit of a search of the literature and found almost nothing. One of the things we did find was that there were a lot of quantitative studies with X number, usually 3 to 4 digits, of surveyed tourists usually exit at an airport, and the question is sort of along the lines of, did you enjoy Australia? Yes, great, board the plane. And it really wasn't, it was very quantitative information, but it was lacking the qualitative social information that we felt would go much deeper into understanding this phenomenon of Chinese tourism in Australia. So, as I said, much of the research was focused on outbound tourism, but didn't really give a sense of what is Australia figuring significantly in discussion from the international literature. It's basically Chinese tourists going to America, going to nearby countries and so on. And as I said, there was also a lot of research was about marketing and forecasting numbers, because that's what they wanted to find out. It wasn't so much about the social, the cultural issues that we thought were important. So those are some of the reasons why we initially engaged in this, this endeavour. So I'm going to start with some history about Chinese tourism in Australia. And contemporary Chinese outbound tourism began in 1984 to nearby locations. That certainly doesn't mean that Chinese engagement with Australia began in 1984. There's a long history in the gold fields and other places of Chinese engagement in Australia, and some of the very early Chinatowns in Sydney and Melbourne have come from that previous engagement. So there definitely was a history of Chinese language newspapers, other social support networks in the Chinese communities, Chinatowns. But by 1999, Australia acquired what's called Approved Destination Status, or ADS, and that becomes important later in this presentation. But it was limited to tourists arriving from Beijing, Shanghai and Guangzhou. So 3 large cities, tier 1 cities in the Chinese network. So it meant that if that's where the approved destination status was from, you're most likely going to get direct flights from those cities, and the people who are travelling are most likely to come from those cities. There's a whole lot of other reasons why that's also so in terms of the Chinese middle class and where they were living and who could afford to travel to more distant places such as Australia, given that a lot of the Chinese outbound tourism international was to nearby places initially. So by 2017, the number of Chinese outbound tourists to Australia, inbound to Australia, was the largest of any country. It surpassed New Zealand. Previously, New Zealand had been high. So that just counts numbers. It doesn't say how long they're staying, how much they're spending or anything, but it just tells you the numbers. So you can tell, even from that very crude measure alone, Chinese tourism is important to Australia as being the largest group. And where were they coming from? Well, partly that it's the Chinese middle class, and we reflect the growth of what we call the middle class in China, but it's clearly, I guess, much more affluent and upper middle class. It's people who can afford to travel in China. So middle class there being inverted commas. But there were other things that were happening that were encouraging the outbound Chinese tourism, not just to Australia, but to other places as well. And it was the internationalisation. So the idea that rather than just staying in China, that you should actually go abroad, learn about the rest of the world, and internationalisation that was supported and encouraged by the government. There were also new flights to Australia in terms of the airlines. So I said at the beginning, first tier cities, Beijing, Shanghai and Guangzhou. Now it expanded beyond the first tier cities. So people didn't have to go to those places to travel, and there were more flight options, which then encouraged more people to go to places such as Australia. It's also the rise of younger and more independent tourists. So initially when the tourism was started, it was group tourism, the flag and the whole group of people following around. And they were often more elderly, mature tourists, partly because they had the time to do it, partly because they were industry-based, they're based upon workplace arrangements and so on. And some of those people had more leave, they could actually do a bit of a tour. So for a whole lot of reasons, and they'd been to other places in some cases. Australia was usually not their first international destination. So for a whole lot of reasons, some of the initial tours were definitely organised group tours, and they involved older Chinese tourists. What we're seeing over time was a rise of younger tourists whose English language was better, used smartphones, more social media. They were getting information, advice from other people on social media, but they could also look up things instantaneously. They didn't need a guidebook or a tour guide to help them. And because their English language was better, they were more confident, with growing in confidence. They also more likely to be able to read signs and ask people, and felt safer coming to a place like Australia. And safety is a big thing in terms of people feeling comfort and wanting to be here. So we have, while that's happening, a whole lot of state governments, not all of the state and territory governments, starting to develop strategies to engage with this phenomenon of Chinese tourism to Australia. And clearly the agenda was to increase it, to amplify the Chinese tourism, particularly the Chinese spend in Australia. So some of those strategies were definitely focused just on China. Others were more broad as an Asia-wide focus, which included other countries near China as well. So yeah, virtually every state had them. And in some ways they were saying fairly similar things. So treat nicely for the Chinese tourists, essentially. Provide more language signposts, etc. Have more direct flights. Think about the types of food they like, and so on. And in many ways, a lot of this actually makes sense. It's the sort of thing that you would do if we're putting together a strategy in this room. We'd probably say a lot of the same sort of things. So there wasn't necessarily a lot of innovation. And I guess having read through some of these strategies, they reflect various levels of understanding and nuance, I guess, about Chinese tourism. So what was happening here in terms of Chinese tourism? The places that Chinese tourists were coming from started to expand. So, as I said, Beijing, Guangzhou, and Shanghai, the first tier cities, but then we started to get direct flights from other locations throughout China, and the number of flights increased. So it was more capacity on the flights, which keeps the cost of travel lower because there's more supply, clearly more demand. Initially, Air China being one of the bigger players, but very soon China Eastern and China Southern became the largest of their carriers to Australia. And there were also newer and cheaper airlines. So you can see here, most of the Chinese tourists actually prefer to fly on Chinese airlines, even though Qantas was flying from Australia, the preference was for Chinese airlines. So Qantas was only garnering about 6% of the market. When you look at that compared to something like China Southern or China Eastern, which collectively have 60% of the market, and if you add Air China, 79% of the market in total. So there are a whole lot of reasons why the growth of Chinese tourism to Australia was occurring, and it was occurring in particular ways from particular places. Yeah, squeeze decide to freeze. Okay, so the number of Chinese tourists was growing. You can see I've just given you the reasons why the number of Chinese tourists were growing, and it was including direct flights to other places other than Sydney or Melbourne, particularly into places like Brisbane and Perth. And it was growing very rapidly up until approximately 2019. And then, as you can see, in terms of the numbers of inbound Chinese tourist visitors, it fell off a cliff, essentially. And it fell off a cliff everywhere. It wasn't just Australia, it was COVID-19. And you can see the impact. It absolutely plummeted. There were pretty much no Chinese tourists coming to Australia. There was very little tourism everywhere. I'm sure we can all remember those days. And you can see a little bit of a rebound now through, in this graph, to 2023. This is a slide I did show in Shanghai, and in Dublin. It was partly to give a sense of where in Australia they were going to. And part of the reason is that there are different locations in Australia affected by state government policies and different types of cities. So therefore that drop in Chinese tourism had different impacts in various parts of the country. So here's a study from 2021. You can see the massive decrease in Chinese visitors, and obviously depends upon who wrote, and different states, the different author wrote the section from different states in this publication. But Sydney economy suffered in Western regional New South Wales because most of the Chinese visitors were coming to Sydney and generally staying in Sydney, not necessarily going to regional New South Wales prior to COVID-19. So in every case, there's a massive decrease in visitors, 99.1% decrease in visitors to Western Australia. That's just huge, and it had various impacts, clearly. So there has been a rebound, and this is official figures that I found available, the June quarter of 2024, and the highlighting is my own on top of it, to highlight a couple of key points. So in terms of the actual total number of visitors, now New Zealand has regained that status as the most 1.2 million trips compared to roughly 750,000 from China. But you can see that the trips are clearly much shorter in terms of the number of nights spent, and it's partly because it would include things like sporting teams coming over to Australia and back, and going back in a day. So there's when we look at the numbers, you need to look at the total numbers, but also the number that's, I guess, really important is highlighted in blue from the economic perspective. Clearly, even though China hasn't rebounded in terms of Chinese inbound tourism to Australia, it is by far the biggest spending, 7.6 billion spent in the 2023-2024 financial year, compared to 2.1 from USA, New Zealand, United Kingdom. So clearly, it's roughly 3.5 times the amount of the other locations. So it's that total spend that becomes very important, and it's partly because they're staying longer than other places, more nights in Australia. As you can also see from the highlight in purple there, is that the Chinese tourism compared to the 2019 levels has not rebounded anywhere near as much as other countries. and that there's reasons for that, but I think it is happening increasingly so, particularly in 2024, and I'll explain that in a few minutes. So you can see this is the one looking at the spending, so you can see the comparative rebound, and obviously this is not accounting for the real dollar value, so inflation, for example, if a country is spending 29% of the 2019 levels, 2021 levels, it doesn't mean real spending of 129%, because there's obviously inflation has occurred in between time. But that sort of highlights that the Chinese spending is still 77% of what it was in the year 2021, not allowing for inflation. And why was that? Well, partly because we know that the COVID-19 outbreak occurred in Wuhan in China, and for a number of years we had this issue where all travellers from China, including those from Hong Kong and Macau, needed a negative COVID-19 test result before they could travel. And Australia wasn't the only country that did this. United Kingdom did as well, United States of America did as well. Clearly the Chinese didn't like it. It was one of a number of tensions, geopolitical tensions, that were occurring at the time. So there are various embargoes on certain products, beef, for example, wine, importantly not iron ore, and China's Ministry of Culture resumed group tours to a number of countries, but not to Australia. So we didn't actually get the group tours, the ADS, coming back in 2023 when other countries, including New Zealand, Singapore, and a list of other countries, Russia and others, it meant that Australia was not likely to rebound very quickly in terms of Chinese tourism. Individual Chinese travel was possible, but you couldn't get an approved group tour. And that meant certain types of visitors were more likely to come to Australia, younger, more educated, those who feel confident, independent travelling. Certain type of visitors who perhaps needed the support of a group tour or felt that that was the way to go were obviously unable to come at that stage. So in 2023, March 2023, Australia dropped the negative COVID-19 test, and lo and behold, on the 10th of August 23, Australia was again included in the approved scheme. So that meant that from pretty much just over a year ago, we have been able to have official group tours. I'd be pretty confident saying that some unofficial tours are being organised beforehand when people come out as independent and then get together once they got into Australia. But any rebound is still going to be affected by things like flight capacity, airline prices, fuel prices, and so on. So just did a quick look through some of the figures and compiled this. Doesn't include passengers from Hong Kong and Macau, which is important, I think, to some extent. The last time I travelled up to Shanghai, to Nanjing and Shanghai, I actually flew up on China Eastern and flew back through Cathay Pacific, so I'm not sure how much that's happening. But you can see that even looking at these figures it's only for a month, July 2023 in comparison with July 2024, it's a snapshot at 2 points in time, that the total number of passengers, generally for most airlines, has increased by sometimes very significant percentages. So the Chinese tourists are returning, and you only need to go to the Quad and the area outside the Quad towards the Chow Chat Wing Museum, and you can see that for yourself in terms of who's coming to Australia. The numbers clearly are up here at the University of Sydney. So, yeah, very quickly, the Sydney international visitor arrivals. You can see that the top one is all types of visitors, and when we talk about visitors and tourists, we need to consider that there's different types. Might be people coming for holiday, people coming to visit friends and relatives, business, or for education. It's not just people who are coming to be tourists. So that terminology is really interesting. What is, I think, particularly interesting in the bottom graph for the Chinese, particularly, is a lack of business officially on business, and clearly education is important. So any moves around education, capping student numbers, possibly has some ramifications in terms of visiting friends and relatives and other aspects of tourism. So I want to change tack a little bit now to then move towards some of the more qualitative work in Sydney. And to begin with, in terms of Australian Chinese tourists to various parts of Australia, one of the quotes there was that Chinese visitors, like other visitors, enjoy doing different things. They want to experience the local. They also want to seek different experiences in a comfortable and secure manner. So that safety is a recurring theme in our interviews and other literature, to feel safe, because they are in a different country, they're not sure about the language. It makes perfect sense that safety is a big concern. John Connell et al. Chinese tourism in Australia has evolved from a general group tourism almost entirely centred on key iconic sites and nature. So iconic nature, koalas, Australian wildlife and so on is very, very popular, towards a more subtle and differentiated niche tourism. And this evolution has been recognised. It's not just in Australia, it's elsewhere. So the Chinese Tourist Academy made a distinction between follow the crowd, in other words, mass tourism, and follow the heart, which is go do your own thing and what you want to do. So whether you want to go surfing in Australia, have an experience rather than seeing something, was considered to be important. So increasingly those who are able, young independent tourists, are doing this sort of thing. They're not just doing that, but that's a change. So if we look at what that means for Sydney, you can see Sydney Airport and the University of Sydney, there are a number of iconic places. A place like Bondi Beach, the Opera House, the Harbour Bridge were always known. They're in every tourist guidebook. You read, pick up Lonely Planet photos, whatever. They'll say, go do this. But there are some other places that were not in those English language guidebooks, were not really well known in Sydney, but and it maybe some of the local people knew about their existence, but suddenly became picked up by Chinese tourists. Places like Diamond Bay, Bear Island, over in Lavender Bay, because they became what's known as Daka places. And that's what I want to talk about for that part of here. So this is partly a creation of the Chinese social media, and fortunately we had Zhu Song to be able to guide us through the Chinese social media, because John and I certainly couldn't do it. And we looked at what they were saying and doing, and there's essentially some new travel itineraries being created here. And they are places that were usually not visited by Australian residents and people from other countries. But the Chinese people were telling each other, come to this place, come at a particular time, bring this, whatever. And that's how the word of mouth was being spread. So the idea is a marked place or a checked in place. You must do this. Check off that you've been to Lavender Bay, Wendy Whiteley's house. Check off that you've been to Bear Island. Check off that you've seen the boathouse in Perth and so on. So this is a phenomenon that emerged in China in the 2010s, and it's pretty much social media that dominated by millennials. And basically people go to some of these spots, take the same sort of photographs in exactly the same place, try and create unique photography, but sometimes they're doing the same thing as a whole lot of other Chinese tourists. And they're trusting other Chinese tourists because they're more like them. It's the same way that farmers trust other farmers. They're trusting people this rather than the official policies and tour guides from Australia. There's a gender element to this. A majority of Daka tourists are middle-class women, white-collar occupations, and they tend to be more highly educated. And there's often travelling together, not in a sexual relationship necessarily, but they're travelling together. So the person in front of the camera is often a woman, but the person behind the camera taking the photograph is also often a woman. So this is about picture being the visual, and it's about colour. So emotional connection with the sites became key elements, and the ability to perform. So you look up at the University of Sydney, if you go to the quad or the area outside the quad, you'll see a lot of people performing for the camera. The performativity is an important part of this. And the other part that's important is the ability to send that performance back to other people in China almost instantaneously. So if you want to do that, your social credibility can be increased. And photography certainly video photography as well encourages performativity, and it goes to the extent of bringing stylized particular clothes to get that perfect photograph. So you pack your luggage with a red dress or whatever else you're advised that it's the best photography. So let's have a look at some examples of this. The first one's in North Sydney. It's a jacaranda tree. You can see a number of Chinese tourists doing things that place themselves in danger of cars on a narrow street. That is a concern. It's not the only place it happens. But there's a performance. It's not just the trees, jacaranda trees, and the colour that's attracted them, but they're in the photograph as well. It's not like a postcard where you're behind the camera taking a picture. It's performing in front of the camera is important. The second one is in Western Australia. Was a photograph that was used in the conversation. It's a boathouse. It's not for those who know WA. It's on the Swan River, not far from the University of Western Australia. The last time I was over there, about 2 months ago, I was driving along the road from Perth towards Fremantle. All of a sudden, I had to slam the brakes on in the car. What's going on here? And then I realised there was a couple of groups of Chinese tourists getting out of off the boat shed, and we're going boathouse, and we're heading into the Ubers and then driving off, and they managed to disrupt traffic on a major road heading west towards Fremantle. Fortunately, it didn't cause an accident that day. But it's the colour of the boathouse, the blue boathouse, is what's attracted them to, and you can see they are there in numbers. Sometimes they go further afield. So Pink Lake in Western Australia, there's a number of pink lakes around Australia, but they'll go further afield to get the colour of the lake. The water is really important. And those people might recognise underground facility, Green Square Library, the new Green Square development, the books, that's attracting people. So that becomes another Daka place, again, because of the colour, the chance to be there, to see, to perform, take photographs. But one place does stand out as being particularly interesting. It's the University of Sydney. Okay, so let's have a quick look at that one. This is from one of the Red Book and Mafengo, some of the Chinese sites. So we've translated this from the Chinese into English. If you want to see a retro campus in Sydney, of course you must come to Sydney University. The historic building is famous as Harry Potter building. It is also a popular place for wedding photography. 3 to 4 p.m. is the best time for photography. You can see the guidance they're giving to other people who are also on Red Book in Chinese. That, Australian policy makers, tourist departments, guidebooks are not picking up at all. Only recently we even started picking up a little bit. On Mafengo, it's definitely a must-have place in Sydney. We spent a lot of time at the University of Sydney, mainly looking for a suitable camera angle. In the case of a large number of visitors, the only thing you can do to make the photograph background more clean is to wait. The University of Sydney is a beautiful environment, and the test season is blooming. At the same time, it's a place where Harry Potter was filmed, which is a good place for leisure. No, it's not where Harry Potter was filmed, but that's what they're being told, and they're being told by tour guides and so on. See, the main goal for the University of Sydney trip, Harry Potter House, the quadrangle. There's a large lawn in front of the main building, which is very suitable for taking pictures. We also saw a couple of wedding couples. The day is beautiful, both inside and outside the Harry Potter house. Even playing with the film, all kinds of poses for more than an hour. Now, I'm not sure how many of you pose for more than an hour, but it's clearly something that people are doing. And clearly the University of Sydney is a suitable backdrop. Why is that the case? It's again social influences and media stars. So Sister Milk Tea she wasn't married here, but they did the wedding photographs at the University of Sydney, which has encouraged other people to have their wedding photographs here. La Perouse Beach is obviously a site as well where you get the waves and very long bridal train for photographs. So the idea of taking photographs, bringing your wedding dress out to Australia for the photograph is something that appeals. And once that starts to circulate on social media in China, then other people do the same thing. I don't know if anybody's seen the Hogwarts crest outside the Great Hall at the University of Sydney to recognise it's Harry Potter. You probably haven't, because this was in on Issoire on 1st of April one year, and you can guess what that 1st of April is. So the University of Sydney is aware of it. So April Fool's Day, the University of Sydney is aware of this. They can't officially say, it'd be a lie to say Harry Potter was filmed here, it's Harry Potter House. We'd be up for misrepresenting ourselves, but you can see they're making fun of it in a way that shows awareness of it. And they're not charging for anything. It suits the University of Sydney because long-term people come visit, circulate a lot of photos of the University of Sydney. We get a lot of free publicity out of this sort of thing. So there are other places. So Lavender Bay and Wendy's Secret Garden. The idea that everybody is taking pictures of the Harbour Bridge and the Opera House, but there's somewhere different here. If you want to avoid the crowds in Circular Quay, head across the other side of the harbour, come to Lavender Bay, will make things different. You get a full and good view of the Harbour Bridge, enjoy taking beautiful pictures, especially in the afternoon. The sunshine makes the bay shining, very different atmosphere, and then you can go relax yourself in Wendy's secret garden. And if anybody has been there, it is a very nice garden. Again, Opera House, too crowded. So these iconic sites, they go there. It's not as if they ignore them. So the creation of Daka sites is additional. There are so many people at the Opera House, I can hardly take a single photo that does not look like a normal tourist photograph. This time I found a new location, Lavender Bay, not far from the Opera House, excellent angle for photography, photographing. There are less people here, very easy to capture amazing pictures. Again, same sort of thing, faces the Harbour Bridge. You can see if anybody doesn't know, that's what they're looking at, that's what they're taking pictures of. Another case is Diamond Bay. Diamond Bay in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. Taking pictures on the cliff is so cool, but be careful. It is easy to get here following Google Map. Free parking here, which is unlike Bondi Beach. There's also a small stone gate where you can take very nice pictures, which is very much resonates with Chinese gold sculpture image as well, but stone gate. If you want to avoid the crowds visiting the usual tourist spots, they're named there, try Diamond Bay. The scenery is spectacular, cliffs and rolling waves. Sometimes you see people climbing on the cliff. Taking red or white dresses will make you look nicer in the picture. Probably doesn't work for everyone. This is a fantastic place, beautiful and quiet. I especially like waves hitting the cliff. I saw people coming here. I highly recommend the spot. One thing to keep in mind is the safety. And you can see the reasons why they're saying this. People have died here. So this is actually, and if there are no signs in Chinese language saying the dangers, then it becomes an issue. If the signs are ignored, it's an issue anyway. Clearly, the desire to get the best spot, the best picture, means that sometimes the signs just aren't going to work. And what we're finding with some of these Daka sites is that all of a sudden the site becomes popular, the dangers aren't recognised, people could potentially get killed in worst case scenarios. Other scenarios are that there's not enough toilets at the place, and local councils to put in more toilets becomes a bit of a problem with traffic on the roads, getting in there, it starts to hold traffic up. And the councils are caught unawares because there's no sense that this was actually a tourist site. It's always existed here. Locals might have known about it, and it hasn't been a tourist site for Anglo, Celtic and other tourists, but all of a sudden the Chinese Daka site has meant that put new pressures on particular locations. One of these locations is Bear Island in La Perouse. If anybody doesn't know, you can see the picture there, the reason for the attraction. You don't have to go to Western Australia to see the sunset over the water. You can go to Bear Island in La Perouse and see the same thing, which is really unusual on the east coast of Australia. So the most beautiful sunset in Sydney. Remember to check the sunset time before heading there. Very beautiful sunset. The photos do not require any polish. A niche marketplace in Sydney, La Perouse. It is a marketplace of the most beautiful sunset. It's a filming location of Mission Impossible. It is witnessed countless wedding couples photos. Easy to get to, and you can see, should not miss the place. All looks good in photos. So in that sense, the idea of place for geographers, place is crucial to understanding independent Chinese tourism. This is not the group tourism where a whole lot of people follow through groups. It is a place is marked and then people independently go to it, guided by advice. You catch a certain bus, it's easy to get to a certain day. Places that are scenic, particularly attractive, especially at moments such as sunset or the flowering of the jacaranda trees. So time of day, seasonality does matter, but equally important is the need for tourists to place themselves in place. It's not a photograph of the sunset unless they're in the photograph of the sunset as well. So to conclude, the identification of marketplaces, in particular the niche marketplaces that are not patronised by many other tourists, highlights a distinctive Chinese tourism geography that's extensive uses through social media, and it's in Chinese language social media that is not known by other people who don't speak Chinese. And the Chinese tourists have used their own experience, not merely to influence those who have followed, but effectively to create a new geography, sort of independent of and different from the traditional tourist guidebooks. Slowly, some of those guidebooks are starting to catch up. The University of Sydney is just starting to get a paragraph of mention in some of these guidebooks, where before it was non-existent. Even though we're Australia's oldest university, roughly 3 kilometres from the city centre, historic architecture, it took the Harry Potter building and Chinese tourists to even get us into those guidebooks. The addition of niche marked places to iconic sites has generated new tourist geography, and the addition is important. It's not as if the other sites are going away. They still visit the Opera House, they still visit the Harbour Bridge, but this is a tourist geography that's accessible to those who are fluent in the Chinese language. And I suspect it is probably starting to permeate out as some of those people who are in places like youth hostels and engaging with other non-Chinese tourists as well start to mention, hey, this is a good place to go to. So we haven't done any studies on that, but I suspect it's starting to move beyond the Chinese population, but certainly has been led by them. And the democratic character of social media has enabled them to engage in placemaking and to insert themselves in place. So again, I've said this before, that those certain types of places stand out. Those that are particularly attractive, special moments, sunset, seasonality, and so on. And it's particularly important for a generation of Chinese tourists, the millennials and in that sense, to conclude, independent Chinese tourists will both visit these Daka sites and go to great lengths to obtain unique selfies that they can share with many people almost instantaneously. I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
So we'll have a bit of time for questions, but I just want to make one point. I was fascinated by the emphasis on the Harry Potter connection. My wife used to teach history at a girls' school, and she used to bring a lot of the kids in to see the Nicholson Museum. And every time she came in, they'd say, "Oh, Miss, it's just like Hogwarts." and that was every single time. So I thought that was interesting. Maybe before we start general questions, John, do you want to have a bit of input, co-author?
Yeah, I think it's interesting how we ever got onto this project in the first place. I think none of us were planning to do research on tourism or Chinese tourism for that matter. But it became apparent that, while we didn't understand it, that every Chinese student on campus was well aware that that was Hogwarts, of course, there. And then it became very apparent that people were coming from, of course, from PRC to visit Hogwarts. Not just, there were two strands in that. One was the people who were coming, younger people, because it was Hogwarts, and there were all kinds of stories about this is where Harry Potter learned to fly, this is where J.K. Rowling became a medical student for some reason. And so there was this extraordinary story emerging. But there was another side of that as well, that the Chinese tourists were also coming because they could see or wanted to see Sydney Uni as a possible location for their children in years to come. So those two things sort of combined to bring these large numbers, which suddenly we discovered. And the other sort of adventitious part of that is Phil and I could do nothing, since together I think our Chinese words add up to about 3 on a good day. So it just so happened that Shesong had just finished her PhD thesis on a very relevant topic, geophysics. And therefore was very happy to interview a whole series of the tourists. So she became the key person, the integral part of the whole project that simply would not be possible without her. So that's what you do when you finish your thesis. You diverge and do something completely different. She may actually be online at the moment, I'm not sure, but she's presently in a postdoc in Austin, Texas, doing proper geophysics again. I suppose it's really interesting. I think it was really interesting to us, partly the Sydney University policy, which was non-existent in all this, and tended to turn a blind eye as much as they could to all these people on campus. I think it's also interesting that, as Phil just said a moment ago, that none of the standard guidebooks on Sydney, whether it's Lonely Planet or Fodor or anybody else, ever mention Sydney University, which is quite extraordinary because of the Gothic building, which I think is an impressive building to many potential visitors, or because of the Nicholson Museum and so on. So it never got in there. The closest it got to one of the guidebooks, I think it was Lonely Planet, was you should visit Glebe because it's kind of folksy sort of place. And then when you've done to Glebe, you should go to Newtown because that's even more fascinating. and you might just pass Sydney Uni on the way, which is on the right-hand side. That was about the only reference we found. But suddenly, after this process had been going on for a few years, suddenly a Lonely Planet picked up on it, and there's a whole paragraph about Hogwarts and so on. So Sydney Uni finally got into the tourist record because of this. But it just, ultimately what was interesting was that when we first started looking at this, it was much more of the group tours, and then the group, and as we got in the subtitle of the book, the group tours then became much more about selfies, taking the picture and sending it back, and then finally became about what we've called red dresses. That these newly emergent sites were posted by the Chinese themselves. So there was a sort of underground tourism which mere English speakers would have no sense that actually exists. But there it was at Lavender Bay, at Diamond Bay, Bear Island, one or two other places as well, Paddington Reservoir. Diamond Bay, incidentally, as Phil said, two people fell off Diamond Bay a couple of years ago. Died. One was a Chinese tourist, one was an English tourist, as a pattern, who was probably over-imbibed on that occasion. And presently the council is fencing it off, so it will no longer be a very attractive site at all. So things have moved on from there. And these sites will continue, I suspect, to emerge in the future. So that's just a little footnote to what Phil was saying.
Thank you. It's really interesting. I like the point that you make about how we're only beginning to comprehend these new geographies now, and how important that is for various safety management reasons. Like, it came up a couple of times talking about the motorway over in Perth, but even other things. Like, I worked in the quad for a couple of years there, and we'd have people who just didn't know they couldn't come and watch us work, like come up into the offices and like take photos of us. And so now there are signs there that the academics have put up, being like, this is a place of work, please don't come into the offices and document it. But, without knowing that these trends are emerging, it's impossible to try and create policies that actually manage it equitably for everyone, right?
Yeah, I certainly agree. And one of the things that's happened since Chinese tourism started through the whole idea of Harry Potter was that the main administrative offices used to be in the quad and a whole lot of other buildings around. Then we have F23, the Michael Spence building, has been built, and that's moved a lot of the way. So Faculty of Arts and Social Science is still in the quad. There are still signs up around the place saying, please be quiet. But this did become an issue, the idea that is the university supposed to be for tourism, for tourists who are seeking an authentic experience of an operating university with lectures, or is it supposed to be for education with the lectures operating without a whole lot of tourists streaming in and watching you work? So yeah, there is definitely a genuine tension there.
I will admit to have been frustrated a few times trying to navigate the quad without getting in people's photos, but absolutely, yeah.
Okay, another question.
So I like your discussion point about how councils are having to plan extra toilets and stuff. And I wonder if things like geotagged photographs emerging or tags from that site could be used as an early warning signal to councils that, hey, this is actually something that is going to be a trend or is likely to be a trend, and is it possible, like an early warning sign?
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer is probably yes. Another part of the question, who pays for it? So you've got local government councils fairly cash strapped because they don't catch the revenue, and they don't necessarily get the benefits in terms of financial benefits unless the spending is in their local area. They have to pay for the toilets, which might be a stop on the way to the Blue Mountains or a stop between Perth and Fremantle, but they have to cough up the money to provide the facilities and ensure safety so they don't get sued or get bad publicity. So there's certainly a number of elements there, but you're right, you could start to identify potential signs. It's probably, at the moment, it's certainly reactive to a trend. It's often very late. That would actually take it forward a bit at least, and get an early start.
Porta potties, like a few of those might save you a lot of.
It might save some lives. The other thing, it's not just Chinese tourists, it also applies to, I'd say, people from other cultures, perhaps Vietnamese, whatever, fishing. In some of the spots, rock fishing, where you have to put signs in other languages, you have to know who's going there and why they're going there and address it appropriately for safety.
Many of these sites were sort of invisible in a way. I mean, few people go to Diamond Bay, so councils were simply not aware generally of what was happening.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. If you see all these geotagged locations popping up, then you can say, well, something's going on there.
Jeff?
Yeah. To what extent do you see this as a uniquely Chinese tourist thing? I mean, all the things you described there are occurring due to social media. Sites become Instagrammable and they're otherwise out of the way and hidden, and then they become big key sites for different markets. So trying to work out to what extent you see it as distinctively Chinese. I think Figure 8 Pool, I remember going there one year, and all of a sudden within a 12-month period it become this Instagrammable location. Everyone was there on the rocks. Similar safety issues, of course.
See back. Okay. Two points, I guess. One is that because it's in Chinese language, it might not be uniquely Chinese, but it's only accessible for the early stage to Chinese tourists. So in that sense, when you go there, if you see sites, there's a lot of Chinese. The Chinese tourists also stand out. They look different than a lot of other tourists. Partly you can't tell the difference between English, American and others. So there was a visibility aspect of it. But I think you're right about the social media. The other part about tourism, I'm thinking here of Harry Potter and the University of Sydney, about that part I think is probably more unique in terms of the language and the cultural translation, the mistranslation between one culture and another around particular places. But campus tourism is something that happens in China. It's like John was saying, young people, if you have one child, the little prince, whatever, you want that person to be, get the best education possible. So they do go to various universities. So the Chinese universities themselves have to cap the number of people on particular days into go to universities for all the same reasons. And it's not unique to the University of Sydney. We handle it by basically letting them roam around, don't charge them to come to the campus or anything. Other universities, usually the famous ones, Yale, Princeton, Harvard, Oxford, have to deal with the same sort of issues of a high number of tourists coming to a particular site, partly for the site itself, the heritage buildings, partly because of potential future education. So it's sort of, in that sense, to answer your question, some of it is unique, but not all of it is unique to Chinese tourism.
I think also it's worth saying that most of the promotion, if that's the word, I'm not sure is the word, was going on one particular platform, Xiaohongshu, which is one where usually used by younger women, about 90% of the users, and that's all it was previously, mainly about shopping and fashion. So it's a sort of in-group promotion.
I'll just mention a couple of the online comments.
Yeah, sure,
A couple of people have said what a brilliant presentation it is. Melissa said she now feels guilty about standing on the corner of Winslow, Arizona. So we're all guilty, she says. And Anjana's got a question about what factors are responsible for any place to get ADS status?
So what factors are responsible for?
What factors are responsible for any place to get ADS status? So I suppose it's unnecessary.
It's the Chinese government need to approve it. That's essentially what it is. If they want to approve it, yes. If they don't, it's potentially a bargaining chip. They can hold it back in the same way they did, prevented wine imports and beef imports and so on. So it's really, it's entirely the Chinese government and whether they're friendly with another country or not. And particularly, I'd say with the previous Australian government, there were a lot of tensions going on, and over time there's gradually been some change towards increasing friendliness. There's still obviously tensions, and one of the results of that has been the ADS has been approved by the Chinese government.
Do you have any sense of whether the Dakas are have a life expectancy, or they're cyclical, or they're just more getting added and fall off as they get too oversaturated?
That's a really good question in terms of certainly more being added. The initial ones don't seem to have died off from what I can work out. And if there's people are still going to these sites, so there probably is some sort of idea that eventually they might have run their life and they're not so great anymore. But at the moment, I don't get a strong sense that this used to be a Daka site, but is no longer a Daka site. But that, yeah, we were asking that question. We really didn't have a clear answer to it. So it's a great question.
Because that would obviously influence like policy decisions around this. Like you don't want to invest a bunch of money in infrastructure.
Yeah.
There's a possibility that it's gonna not be a thing in 5 years or whatever.
In China, they are very much cyclical, so they do change steadily over, well, steadily quite quickly over time. The only people here posting on Xiaohongshu or anywhere else are almost always posting positively about those places. It was almost impossible to find a post that said, I went to this place because it was recommended, it was crap, something like that. The only place that was disappointing to anybody, I think, that we saw online was the one, the picture that Phil showed of the Green Square Library. And so this is a long way to go just to look at one wall in a library. And so I think that one's quite likely to drop out. But others will, I suspect, emerge.
Yuri, I think.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Shiori. I'm from Anthropology Department. Yeah, thank you so much for the great presentation. I want to follow up on the previous questions that was asking about to what extent it's unique to Chinese tourism. I just wanted to highlight the different aspects. And so I think tourism experiences are shifting from consumptions to experiences, and I think your presentation showed that brilliantly. And it looks like among the Chinese tourists, the experience that's valued is the visual aspects of it. So I wanted to ask, to what extent do you think it's unique to Chinese tourism to have that emphasis on visual, or do you think that's the larger trend among the tourism in general to emphasize the visual elements? And the second related point, I thought what was really unique there was the emphasis on safety. Because when you're thinking about youth tourism, backpackers, etc., risk-taking is part of the adventure. So I wonder if it's related to their class background or...
Okay, yeah. I was trying to take the question first. If you're a Chinese person and you're a young child, there's that responsibility as well to the family, and so safety is important in the context that there's only one person, they understand looking after the parents and things. So that is very much cultural, and that I think that does make a difference. And the other aspects of safety, the generation is more risk-taking, but if they feel safe, it's the perceptions of safety. So the front cover, that was a picture of a woman surfing with a surfboard. That's an experience, and that's not unique to Chinese culture. More people are looking for experience and authentic tourism rather than something that's manufactured, the so-called tourist trap. And that's how I think that applies across various cultures. What perhaps going to the first question is different is when Chinese tourists come, and they're not homogenous, right? I mean, probably should emphasise that more in the talk itself. They're coming from different parts, and there are different, obviously different genders. There's a whole lot of factors that create different Chinese tourists. So even calling Chinese tourists is misrepresenting the diversity amongst them. They bring, there's certain cultural values about photography, about image. So one of the things I said before about campus tourism and coming to the University of Sydney, it's really popular in China to go to universities, campus tourism. So in some ways they're doing the same sort of thing that they're doing in China. They're surprised when they get here, and there's usually, unless it's a graduation, nobody's saying you can't walk on the lawn, and they're not charged to enter the gate, and you can spend as long as you like wandering around taking photographs. So that aspect of time, all those things are reflective of partly what's not in Chinese culture in some ways. So in some ways they're noticing the difference between their culture without saying it and what they're finding in Australia. Thank you.
Liam was next.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Real fascinating stuff. I've got a half-formed question that I don't quite know how to ask, but do you get in the conclusion or anywhere, do you get onto talking about the types, how this process is affecting the meanings that we ascribe to places? Like tourism plays such a role, right, in comparison to or adjacent to sort of more historical tourism, ecotourism, Aboriginal tourism, these types of tourisms that really engage with the meanings and stories and memories that we have about places. Because I'm thinking particularly about a place like the University of Sydney, which which is of course a colonial palimpsest on top of Gadigal land, right? And now you have this other Harry Potter layer of meaning that comes and is set over the top of this other fake history that's been invented in order to erase someone else's history. Like it's just, I don't know, do you go into that at all?
I can answer. I'm not going to add to it. Look, I think it's really important, and it's troubling to me, and some of those pictures of La Perouse, for example, and looking at social media, there was very, very little indication of education for Chinese tourists around, this is settler colonial society and Aboriginal land and culture, country. So yeah, that's, and the idea that sort of a constructive narrative around Harry Potter could supersede some other genuine narrative about Gadigal country and so on is really troubling. But it's clearly what's happened. It probably provides some opportunity in the future for education. So I'm honestly not sure how much education around Australian history is happening. From what we worked out, and John can probably correct or add to this, there seemed to be less emphasis on Chinese tourists understanding Australian history in sort of any detail that way, but more on experiencing nature and particular iconic species in nature. That seemed to be the focus. So how open they would be to a different understanding of history, I'm not sure, but I also argue once we know and engage what ethical responsibility we have to convey that and an accurate, sort of, I would argue, historically informed view of this country. So, John, did you want to add anything to?
Oh, simply to say that many many tourists still came on group tours, and group tours flashed through extremely quickly. I mean, we didn't actually, Shesong didn't actually talk to many of the people on group tours because they weren't there long enough to tie them down to a conversation of more than 30 seconds. So during that time, there was a lot of opportunity for people to learn about Indigenous history or indeed simply the Blackett buildings or whatever it is. By contrast, individual tourists, who became important in the second phase, did have time, but had no particular person to mentor them. And so they probably weren't learning a great deal either about Indigenous history or, again, anything else. And if you're on a group tour, a good selling point is this is where Harry Potter learned to fly, rather than the Indigenous history of central Sydney.
Any more questions?
I remember being in Kunming, I don't know how many years ago, and there was a bookshop selling pirated Chinese editions of the latest, whatever it was, Harry Potter book before the English edition was publicly available. So I think the interest in Harry Potter has been really deep. It's really deep seated. Anyhow, I think that's it. Thank you very much, Phil. That was really good. We had another